Good evening, Australian time, morning, UK time. I'm Austin, and this is the Fair Go Basic Income Discussion Group. We are an extension of Basic Income Australia. And we have joined today by Jeff Crocker from the UK, who's written a book called Basic Income and Sovereign Money, which I think is a fantastic book. I've read it. I know Michael, who's here, has also read it. Anyone who hasn't read it should read it. Jeff, why don't you take us through the basic premise of that book, just in, as simple a language as you can, and then we'll open up to questions from people. I might get us started if no one else has a question. Anyone who does have a question, please use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and I'll try to get to you in the order that you raise your hands. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Austin. So I came to Basic Income from a career in technology. So I was working in consultancy, strategic issues to do with the management of technology and industry, and inevitably saw the effect of technology firsthand in the industrial environment, increasing productivity, reducing employment, and therefore, taking wage out of the economy. So I did a MA in philosophy of science and then wrote a book on philosophy of technology, out of which I then developed the view that technology is sucking income out of the economy. And that if you have a high-tech economy, inevitably you will need increasing amounts of non-employment income, whether those are welfare benefits, dividends, pensions, or worryingly, household debt. So household debt was increasing, in my view, to make up for income lost through employment. And although employment numbers have held up, as you well know, the quality of employment has not. So we've got in-work poverty, we've got low wages, we've got massive bifurcation of the labour market such that you've got megabuck salaries coexisting with in-work poverty. So I then had this thesis that technology is sucking income out of the economy and at the same time creating debt. And this came to me from a little thought experiment, which you've heard, Austin, from me before, a thought experiment of a totally automated economy. And if you could plug a machine into Earth in the thought experiment and produce all the goods and services we need without any labor, clearly there'd be no wage, clearly there'd be no way for people to buy those goods and services. So the only way to do it would be by giving everybody vouchers, taking those vouchers back in each year and reissuing them every year. And in that little thought experiment, the vouchers represent basic income because everybody needs an income in order to purchase the necessities of life. And the vouchers also represent what I call debt-free sovereign money, i.e. they're simply issued by government. So the nuanced argument for me is that in a partially automated economy, we need a partial element of non-employment income, the best form of which is basic income for various secondary reasons. And we also need a slug of debt-free sovereign money from the government. And in my view, the proof that this is the case is that without them, we get their surrogates, i.e. the surrogate for the basic income we need is household debt, which is mounting everywhere and caused the crisis of 2007. And the surrogate for the debt-free sovereign money that we need is government debt, which, as we know, is now exceeding 100% of GDP in many developed countries, and in Japan, it's 235% of GDP. So these debts are mythical, they're not repayable. They represent a surrogate for what I will call debt-free sovereign money. So the book is exploring that, basically. The book is exploring the reduction of labor income in the economic mix and the increase of unearned income and the need for a basic income at macroeconomic level. So my interest is mainly macroeconomic, and we've currently funded a couple of studies at Cambridge University, well, one with a consultancy that came out of Cambridge, to look at the consistency of macroeconomic amount of basic income together with a macroeconomic amount of debt-free sovereign money. And finally, I do claim that the current paradigm, the current pandemic, has shifted us to a paradigm which has demonstrated the viability of that position. So in the UK, we've paid £24,000 a year to 3 million individuals, costing us £72 billion, totally funded within the Bank of England, the central bank's purchase of £875 billion of government debt in the secondary market. And since the Bank of England, central bank's owned by the government, my claim is that this isn't debt at all. So it is a demonstration that debt-free sovereign money allied to, of course, it's not a UBI, the furlough, but a sort of quasi-UBI mechanism, has proved sound. You know, it's not caused a hyperinflation, it's not caused devaluation, as the scaremongers have made out. So hopefully that sort of summarizes my thesis, but I'm clearly open to discussion on it.
I've got a great jumping off point. There's several things I'd love to raise, but what I'll go with first is you mentioned inflation. Oh, there hasn't been hyperinflation. If you were to do a Google search for the term inflation, you'll find a lot of people saying, "Oh, inflation's hitting decade highs," and so on. And a lot of people will who have a sort of a casual interaction with the economic news will say, "Isn't there actually a huge problem with inflation in the US at the moment?" People are talking about the cost of living a lot in Australia, not necessarily inflation. What makes you so sure that inflation isn't about to sort of blow up in everyone's faces?
Well, I don't think it's about to blow up in everyone's faces, but I do think, yeah, there is a temporary blip in the supply chain in the global economy. You're seeing, if you take the example of an airline, if an airline were to space its seats, then clearly its average costs would go up. We're also seeing some withdrawal from the labour market. So participation rates are currently declining rather than increasing. So the pandemic has brought about a shock which we are adjusting to. But my longer term view is that technology will continue to increase productivity, because if you look not over the last 2 or 3 years and the next 2 or 3 years, but you take a 100-year view, which is covered actually more in my first book on the philosophy of technology, which is a free download from the website philosophyoftechnology.com. There in that 100, 200-year span, I mean, the productivity increase, of course, in clothing, in food and whatever else has just been huge. The machines work. Even in the crisis in 2007, the crisis wasn't to do with the supply side. When you had a subprime crisis in the United States, the houses were there. The supply side could build the houses. There just wasn't the money into the consumer's pocket to be able to buy them. So, we're hamstringing ourselves on our own artifact by letting money control us, the tail's wagging the dog. But so, yeah, I do expect, and it's not only expect, I mean, one is seeing a current upward blip in inflation. But for that to become permanent, you'd have to see either unrestrained demand or significantly constrained supply. There are temporary constraints on supply, but I think that they will iron out.
Now, I have a little pet theory, which I'm going to indulge myself in since no one's put up their hand yet. So that's a good reason for everyone to start putting up their hands to keep me on track. But I'm a believer in that basically the prevailing conditions are deflationary, right? But that the government is, well, not the government so much, but central banks are, paddling furiously against this current by keeping interest rates really low and quantitative easing and stuff like that. And what that's leading to is, these sort of debt fuel bubbles. You mentioned household debt. Australia has some of the highest household debt levels in the world and in history at the moment. So there's, we're hearing about how great the Australian economy is going, but I'm also hearing that everybody's in debt. And it's like, is that an economy that's going great when everybody's in debt? So some thoughts about that. But, there's been this spike in commodity prices, right? And there's all this leveraged investment everywhere. Is it possible that this inflation thinking could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, where people think, oh, there's going to be inflation, there's going to be a spike in an asset, especially commodities are going to go up, with all this cheap financing sloshing around, all the speculators pile into the commodities market, create the inflation they said was going to happen, and the whole thing sort of blows up in that regard. Is it something you'd rule out, that there'd be a further spike?
No, I don't rule out a further spike. And, you can always see speculative short-term swings. I mean, it's like when George Soros famously bet against the pound. And these are, as you say, self-fulfilling prophecies in speculative markets. But over the medium to long term, they have to obey the fundamentals. You can't go on creating speculative delusions. You've got to, ultimately, they will obey the fundamentals. And as you say, it's deflation in the sense that prices, real prices, continue to decline. So they say the only thing in the UK market that's increased in real prices since the Second World War is fish and chips. Everything else, the real price is reduced because we've got wealthier. And technology will continue, as far as I can see, to make that the case. Because if we were sort of hitting some real barrier in technology, then I'd think again. But although there are questions about the so-called productivity puzzle, which we could come to if you like, nevertheless, the fundamental technology, as you and I know, we can order anything anywhere we like on the internet. We don't even have to go out the front door. You don't go to a bank anymore, and so on and so forth. So in all these service sectors, even in some restaurants and shops and so on, the supermarkets are now opening unstaffed supermarkets and so on. Well, apart from security guards at the exit, that seems very, very set to continue. Together with AI displacing medical searchers, displacing legal searchers, and taking time away from current professionals. So I think the technology is set to keep bounding ahead. But there are some productivity puzzles because, in my view, that's because we've tried to load the work environment with all the costs of society. And I think, frankly, that's a mistake. I think society should face up to what the social costs are and pay it as society, not keep trying to load it onto the workplace. So this increase in the retirement age, in my view, is an absolute nonsense, and the only reason it's done is to keep people off the pension, to keep them off the streets, as it were, rather than funding a proper social pension through debt-free sovereign money. The end result is, I live very close to Rolls-Royce Aero Engine factory here in Bristol, where I started my career. People are now staying there another 5 years, another 10 years. So they don't have to draw a pension. And is that producing more aero engines? No, it's not. Therefore, there is a productivity paradox. And I think the increased retirement age is certainly one contributor to that.
Now, I'm going to go to Michael, who's got his hand up.
Okay, thanks, Austin. And Jeff, I've got to say, I've been interested in basic income for about 40 years, since about the 1980s. And having read lots and lots of things, I've got to say your book is absolutely spot on. So I just think you have really nailed the critical aspects of both the sovereign income and the basic income. And I wanted to really say that we've been working on a policy document for Basic Income Australia, and it's now scattered with quotes and references to your book, because I think it, as I say, the book really nails for us, I think, the main issues around sovereign money being available to fund UBI. And I think what I picked up from your book, you're not trying to make it exclusive. Governments still get it, and you're also leaving room for banks to still operate. And I think that recognition that you need the three arms, the UBI, the government deficit funding, and the bank lending are critical. What I would ask is, of those three, do you see a priority? In other words, if you're going to create inflation by increasing lending or increasing the deficit or increasing a UBI, what should you tackle first as a priority?
Well, thanks for that encouragement, Michael, and I'm glad to be collaborating with you in that sense. One's thinking kind of evolves, and one's thinking also adapts to present situations. Keynes famously said something like, when the facts change, I change my ideas. And of course, facts are changing in the sense that we face different phenomena like the pandemic and so on, and like the leap in AI. But to try to come back to your question, I was talking with someone in India yesterday, and the main issue that we keep hitting is this question of the definition of affordability. How does a society define its concept of affordability? So in the developing countries, and I'm recently talking with Malaysia and Vietnam, they are constrained by these debt to GDP ratios of 55%. They're not allowed to go beyond it. that's crippling their economic development. India's got up to 80%, but as we all know, the developed world is hypocritically running 100 to 250% debt to GDP ratios. So out of the conversation in India came this view, okay, we were both in favor of a basic income, although actually my correspondent in Bangalore wasn't so convinced of the basic income argument, but because he's more into targeted welfare and said, that the Indian philosophical position, and the same in China, is more oriented towards targeting rather than universality. So, that's a discussion we've got to have. But there was absolutely common ground that whether you went for universality or targeting, nevertheless, affordability is the big issue. And therefore, to persuade the world of debt-free sovereign money is, for me at the moment, the present priority, because it unlocks my colleague Malcolm Torrey, as you may know, spends a lot of his time defining basic income, which I tease him about occasionally. But to me, the real definition is the definition of affordability, because that's the issue which most people put up against basic income. Now, the MMT school shares some similarities here, because Randall Wray and Stephanie Kelton both argue for government issue of sovereign money. The difference is that they still insist it should be debt, and I don't understand why. If they're still saddling the economy with the debts you've just mentioned, both consumer debt and government debt, we are again hamstrung by our own artifice. Not by the reality of what we can really produce. So I know how they get there, because they're following the Wynne Godley line of thought that you create a debt, it's matched by other surpluses in the economy through Godley's so-called identity. But I do worry whether they've got that quite right. And I say to them, but why define it as debt in the first place? And Michael Kumhoff, his name is, who's head of research at the Bank of England. He's German and he was previously at the IMF for 12 years. He's putting papers out now regularly, academic papers, that say money quintessentially is not debt. Either in an accounting sense, it's not debt, because when the central bank creates money by a keystroke into people's accounts, hasn't borrowed it from anybody, it's just created it. So neither legally nor in an accounting sense is it debt. So to me, it's a rather long answer to your question, I'm afraid, but it's this attempt to redefine affordability with debt-free sovereign money. And it isn't necessarily that causes inflation, but to start with, I would just reconfigure the definitions. So I would take out household debt and put in a chunk of basic income that's macroeconomically equal to it. And I'd take out government debt and put in debt-free sovereign money. And from that redefined position, I'd then allow the evolution of a greater level of basic income and debt-free sovereign money.
Okay, I've got some other questions, but I'll hang off.
No, we'll go for them.
Oh no, we'll go to Eddie, because Eddie's got his hand up. But before we move on, I will repeat. I will say one thing that we like to say at Basic Income Australia is that you wouldn't necessarily count a basic income as government spending debt, because it's not government spending; it's citizen spending. It's actually a distinct stream of money into the economy from normal government spending through public works or traditional sort of targeted welfare. But you don't have to respond to that. Let's go to Eddie, unless you want to, but or should we just go to Eddie? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So Michael can come back around in the queue if he wants, but go ahead, Eddie.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, with the idea of productivity growth, sort of taking labor income out of the economy, if you consider example like, say, Walmart automating the cashier function, and they have an upfront investment, and then after they do that investment, then they no longer have to hire so many people to be cashiers. I would ask whether you would consider that at the same time that you're reducing labor income, are you also increasing capital income? Would you consider sort of income inequality to be a measure of what productivity growth is doing in the economy?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. There's this whole bifurcation in the employment sector between people on, as I said earlier, people on megabucks and people on incomes that aren't sufficient to meet household needs, and driving them into payday lender debt positions. Yeah, absolutely. The technology is causing huge inequality. That's one of the major dysfunctionalities of our present paradigm.
Right. And as a follow-up, so if you look at income inequality, it goes up during the golden age after the Great Depression, from the 40s to the 70s, and then income inequality goes down from the 40s to the 70s during the golden age, and then comes back up from the 70s to the present era. Do you have any thoughts about how that happens during the golden era? I'm sure you have increasing productivity growth at the same time that you have increasing labor income and sort of widespread benefits. Do you have any thoughts about how that occurs, and is that sort of the phenomenon that we would get if we put in a UBI through sovereign currency?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, yeah, it's a very, very interesting point, and I don't pretend to be able to answer everything. I'm on these I don't like the Q&A style. Actually, I normally talk about the debate. You made a very good contribution to that debate, and the two explanations people have for income being sucked out of the economy are A, technology, but B, labor bargaining power. So some of my friends on the left, and I'm pretty much on the left, probably slightly more centre than some of them, argue that that's the whole thing, that it's wicked capital that's sucking income out of people and depressing the working class. Now, of course, I understand the political class dynamics of that, but I'm not convinced, although I can see that for certain periods you're pointing out, the labour share does look better, and that does look as though it may be associated with a stronger trade union movement. But my point back is that these two factors are not in competition. In fact, they're complementary. So if technology is reducing the demand for labour, then by definition, labour has a lower bargaining power. And my worry is that even if you made the trade unions, gave them all power, all power is given unto them, would this really rectify the inequality situation? And I'm afraid I don't think it would. So I'm in favour, of a strong trade union voice and so on, but bearing in mind they don't represent everybody, they represent their own members. So that, in a sense, is also a different slice of inequality. I mean, trade unions are not normally interested in universality. And in fact, interestingly, most trade unions oppose basic income because actually they're still wanting to get waged income. So everybody still believes in the political scene, both in the UK, both conservatives and socialists believe that we can recover a high wage, high tech, high work society. I don't think we're going to be able to, and that at least we should have a kind of plan B, which says that if it doesn't re-emerge, which I don't think it's going to do, we need to get income to people and we need to get debt out of the economy. So, thanks. That's a very interesting insight.
Emma.
Sorry, I have a question, but I'm happy to debate as well. But so I've heard a bunch of people who support a UBI also say that it's not quite time yet. Is there like an idea? Is there like from a theoretical point of view, in your opinion, is there like an optimum point in which bringing it in would be most ideal? Or is there like a robust and simple way to justify, like, no, now is better, the sooner the better, because then we can move out of this deflationary situation, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're ideally placed to go for it sort of reasonably big time now, because as I said earlier, the pandemic has shifted us a quantum leap into something akin to a UBI structure. We've had these furlough schemes. We've funded them by the central bank buying government debt, which is equivalent to debt-free sovereign money. I'd like to see us campaigning and saying, here is a paradigm that we should now install, if you like, as the dominant paradigm. So, and I also think, as my book shows, that historically, since 1948 in the UK economy, and I mean that's the economy that I've got ease of access of data to. It's not that I think it's it's not the most important economy in the world, of course, but and in all that period of time, the lack of basic income has led to an increase in household debt. So as several of the contributors to the conversation were saying, we're loaded with this debt at household level and at government level, and we've got to re-engineer the economy so the debt's out. So I actually personally think that the UBI is long overdue.
Emma, you muted yourself if you had a follow-up.
No, that's really good. That's a really good point. So basically, and the longer we wait, right, the worse the growing household debt and the worse is current sort of things snowball. Yeah, that makes good sense.
We're going to go. Sorry.
And that's why I'm not personally so keen on pilots, you see, because pilots tend to kick it into the long grass. And, we can never pilot, by definition, universality. The idea of pilot, the idea of universality, unconditionality, and permanence just don't go together. And so all of the pilots are limited to be less than universal, to be less than unconditional, and all the rest of it. So, and yeah, we get the Finland effect. It's 2 years preparing it, 2 years doing it, 2 years studying it. And then the guys say, "You've had your go, now go away," And I actually think we've got to be a bit bolder and braver. And I also think that we've got to address the central bankers, the government economists, the financial journalists, the think tanks. We've got to get these people on board, because a civil rights movement, which also has validity and significance, at the end of the day, if we haven't persuaded the technocrats, it won't happen. And equally, if we have persuaded the technocrats, like with QE, I mean, QE was introduced in the UK by about 2 people in the Bank of England and 2 people in HM Treasury. There was no mass movement for it at all. And they immediately spent 435 billion quid in the first round. So, I'm very, very keen, and I would be very keen to work with all of you to address central bankers, government economists, and so on in the Australia context.
Oh, bringing up the... Sorry, Michael, you go ahead, but we'll...
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, Jeff, I hate to be in furious agreement again, but on the wages side, the way that we've been looking at it in our policy document is to say, look, wages aren't the solution, no matter what, no matter unions bargaining, because 50% of the population at any time cannot work in the paid economy. There are young or old, incapacitated, they're unpaid carers, and people who are between jobs, they're between jobs, and so they can't work. So at that point in time. So, and of that, about 12 to 15% are in poverty. They're mostly single women with kids, looking after, and old people and disabled and so on. So it doesn't matter how much how many jobs you create, those people can't take the jobs, and so we absolutely do need a UBI. So I was really delighted to hear you just say that you would be happy to work with us, because I was going to leave this request to the end, but I'm now going to put you on the spot and say, if we forwarded the paper to you, Jeff, would you mind running your eye over it? Because I do feel we're picking up pretty well all the points that you've made in your book, and maybe offering some other insights that I hope you might find interesting, but to get your perspective would be really valuable.
Well, thanks, Michael, and I'd be very, very happy to work collegiately with you on this. I mean, I recently did an internal seminar with the Bank of England Research Department, and I said to them, first of all, thanks for letting me in, because who am I? I'm a nobody. But secondly, please be strong in your critique. In other words, please don't be polite. I want to hear what you have to say in criticism. So 20 minutes after the presentation, and they said to me, well, Jeff, within the confines of the confidentiality of this research group, which I'm slightly breaking by saying this, in other words, well, they weren't really saying it's confidential. They're saying we cannot speak for the bank. We're not the governor, we're not the exec committee. Nevertheless, and there were about 12 people there, they said, we agree with everything you've said. Now, I mean, that's why I'm keen to be able to put the argument, including in Australia, China, and this week, actually, I've had a huge interest from China, India, Australia, yourselves, the USA, and Finland. I'm going to a conference in Helsinki at the end of November. But I'm saying to them, look, it's lovely to meet activists, but I want to meet the central bankers. So again, we're inviting the head of research of the Bank of Finland to the, now at that level, of course, we can't just go in for a harangue. You know, we've got to go, as I think you're saying, with a properly marshaled argument, evidenced, carefully thought through. And we've also got to show ourselves open to you know, somebody pushing back on some issues. So, you know, people who are arguing for targeted benefits, of course, they are also people who care about social justice, and therefore we can't write them off as being, you know, there are companions in many ways, there are co-travelers, but they have a different formula. And I think we've got to be a lot more open-minded. Not, I don't mean you, but I mean, you know, we as a UBI movement. Yes. In addressing those concerns and so on. So, you know, I'd be very, very happy to collaborate with you, and particularly with the aim of tackling those groups of think tanks for journalists. I mean, Martin Wolf at the FT, you know, I mean, people take a lot of note of what Martin Wolf says, and I've been badgering him for a dozen years or more. I can't match your 40 years, but about a dozen years or more. And he is turning round. I mean, last year he listed my book in his reviews, which he wouldn't have done a couple of years before that. He thought I was a crank and a nutcase, which maybe I am. But you know, now we are beginning to shift opinion. And of course, it takes some of these financial journalists. They're worried that if they stick their head above the parapet, it'll get chopped off. You know, somebody say, "Ah, you're stupid, Martin Wolf," and all the rest of it. So they're very worried about their community support and respect. So we've got to work on it professionally, basically.
We have a couple of journalists in Australia who are keen supporters and certainly would be able to promote what you're saying, Jeff. So yeah, anyway.
I'm very happy to work with you, very happy. Yeah.
We'll go to Eddie and then Bernice. Eddie, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering, Jeff, if you would consider that a monetary UBI or a sovereign currency UBI would increase the demand for labor by increasing aggregate demand, and if that's so, whether we might be able to explain the increase, and then the increase in wages, the golden era from the 40s to the 70s, and then the current era where wages have been stagnant for 40 years through the wage and consumer spending loop.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point, Eddie, and I mean, that's why we've started these two macroeconomic modelling exercises with UK data. We'd like to make it available as a model for other national economies data as well, because the microstimulation studies that have been done, they don't follow through with the macroeconomic implications you've just been talking about. So, if we either increase a slug of UBI, or in many of the other revenue neutral schemes, we reallocate incomes within the same welfare benefit group, it will have macroeconomic implications, as you say, because it'll feed through the consumption function. And famously, people on lower incomes, of course, have a higher propensity to consume, and possibly a lower propensity to consume imports, although that's less clear these days with so much production coming out of China. But they're less likely to buy a BMW car and so on. So anyway, whatever the effect is, we do need to model the effect through the macro economy. And yeah, I mean, Keynes's prediction that we'd all by now be working 15-hour weeks and living like kings and queens hasn't quite happened, but it partially has happened, but it hasn't totally happened because we found more things to consume. So I mean, that puts us also into the growth or no growth discussion. To what extent do we want to continue to consume? We clearly want people who are in poverty to consume more because we don't want them to be in poverty. And therefore, how do we envisage the total future production and consumption, which includes the consumption of higher income groups at the moment? And how is that redefined, constrained, and so on? But I certainly agree with you. We need to look at the macroeconomic implications through the consumption function, the effect on the investment function, production function, government funding, imports, exports, the whole of a normal macroeconomic model of the economy. And that's what we're trying to do in these two models at Cambridge, which we'll report in about 6 months.
Wonderful.
Bernice.
You're muted, I think. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. A little earlier, you were saying you wanted that you were making the distinction between grassroots movement and the technocrats, and you said you really wanted to speak with the technocrats because it's them that make things happen. I'm probably being a little bit naive here, but if a party comes in and manages to go in on the UBI, wouldn't that be a democratic path into getting it in? And would we still need the technocrats to agree to this, if you will?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with you that if that can come through a democratic route, then and a government is elected which is committed in its manifesto to install a UBI, then yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is a route to getting there. At the same time, the technocrats are notoriously competent at frustrating anything they don't want to do. And I mean, not totally, because the civil services are most.
Could you give me an example of that, of them frustrating something that?
Yeah, I mean, the Labour government in the UK in the post-war period did find it a struggle to work with the established civil service. Now, of course, they won. I mean, the Labour government won, and they did get the National Health Service installed. But nevertheless, you've got to face some institutional resistance. But on an issue which has a technical element to it, like the proposal for debt-free sovereign money, that does have a technical element to it, which there are a lot of people, even at activist level, who will say debt-free money, that's just nonsense, it doesn't add up, it's, so on. So, I mean, so it's quite difficult to get widespread popular agreement on something which has a technical element to it. So, and I mean, we've had recently, I mean, this is regrettable from my point of view, but personally, I'm fundamentally against Brexit, you see. So I'm a committed European, and I never wanted to see Brexit. And we had, 3 million people marched on London against Brexit, but Brexit still happened. Now, of course, there was a democratic vote. I understand all of that. But even so, a very close democratic vote with an extreme outcome of a hard Brexit. So, the ways in which, I'm waffling a bit, I know, but the ways in which a democratic movement is formed, gets into an election manifesto, and then is voted in and then is implemented. Yeah, that's certainly a very valid route. But I think that, at the end of the day, if you get the governor of the Bank of England and all of if the vast majority of the technocrats in the central bank saying, sorry, this just is impossible, that's going to be a big difficulty. Isn't
that where a community conversation starts to happen? So, and I'm meaning that on two fronts. One, where we turn around and we're saying, hey, wait a minute, we're producing enough to more than comfortably house, feed, clothe everyone with plenty left over. So if that's not happening, it's a societal choice. And what does that say about us as a society? So that's one path. And then there's the other one that turns around and says, here in Australia, for example, on the issue of the vaccinations, we've spent, 30 million? There were 30 million Pfizer units at $30 a pair, not a pair, a dose, I beg your pardon. That equates to almost $1 trillion. So the government was happy to pay that on a drop of a hat.
Yeah.
Why can't it make that decision elsewhere? And this is going to, if they keep going on that, it'll be. So I think it sounds to me like there's a little bit more. We need to not be scared.
There's more politics in it. There's more politics in it.
It's about changing the talk that we're doing.
Well, what I was going to say to Jeff is, didn't you just say you met with the central bankers in the UK, and they were already pretty much on board, which implies that in fact that the blocker is political or even philosophical.
Well, yeah, but you then get back into this, how does society change its mind on science, for example? I mean, Max Planck, the German scientist, famously said that scientific theory changes one funeral at a time. It's only by the death of the previous generation of scientists that scientific theory moves on. So, I mean, however correct technically a proposal may be, there is a need for us to understand what the processes are by which it comes into being. And Bernice is quite right, of course. It can enter through a mass movement, such as happened in the UK in the post-war period, for social justice, for health and education free at the point of consumption. And that had such mass appeal with people like Aneurin Bevan determined to spearhead it, that, yeah, I mean, it went through exactly the path Bernice has said. So far, we're struggling to see that in the political scene, certainly in the UK. I mean, the Green Party have adopted basic income, and the Liberal Dems have said they have, but it's getting stuck into consultation groups which are losing it.
Could the very issue be that the social democratic workerist laborist movement was able to have a broad paradigm that made sense, sort of soft Marxist view of the world that made sense, which is fundamentally at odds, as you say, with this view you've got of technology, necessarily reducing the role of waged labor. And so that it's precisely this sort of mismatch between social democratic ideology and the sort of realities of what technology is doing that's crippling the left generally, which is why we can't do anything. We can't get things like in Australia, everybody wants Medicare to cover dental. There's lots of stuff we can win a poll on, right? That the left has popular support on infrastructure and fast trains and all kinds of stuff. But we just can't get anything across the line because the Labor Party hates itself and needs to die, basically. I mean, that's as far as I can figure out. Like, I don't know.
Sorry, Jeff, if I could just take you back to an earlier point where you were saying we seem to have agreement, but then it gets stuck in the politics. I was wondering if you could point me in the direction of where in the politics it's getting stuck.
Well, if you take the Lib Dems example in the UK, they had a conference decision to adopt basic income. So they then, which in my view wasn't all that well argued, but nevertheless they won the vote. So they then constitute some working group to put together what that policy will actually be. That working group's now got dominated by accountants who think it can't be. So, I mean, they're sort of.
But just keep the
back.
accountants out of it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I get rid of all accountants. Yeah, I mean, there is a major difference, of course. You see, between accountancy and economics. In accountancy, money has exogenous standing. It has a value. It's the arbiter. In economics, it's endogenous. So the value of money depends upon what you produce and what you consume, and all the rest of it. So it's a fundamentally different view, where the accountants think the money value is external and reigns supreme, and the economist is saying no, not at all. I mean, what we can produce, as you were saying earlier, is what we can make available, and the money value is just an intermediary in the process.
So how do we change the conversation from the money is the value to the money is the oil that runs the machine?
It's very difficult because the accounting paradigm is a simpler one to understand because people face it every day in their own lives. It applies to individuals.
Oh no! Wait a second. That's a very interesting. We're
doing it now, Bernice. We're doing the thing where you can teach everyone to change the paradigm right now. I'd like to go to Stephen. He's had his hand up for a while. Do you want to put your hand up and come back around? And we'll pick up again in a minute. Okay,
I just want to take on this one point. Where you're saying that it's so my background is that I studied economics, and to be honest, most of it felt very magic-y, but so did finance. But it wasn't until I read Modern Monetary Theory that I went, hey, oi, this makes sense. So there is a point at which accounting, because it was accounting thinking that made sense to me in an economic theory. So I don't know if I'm explaining this, but there is a bridge there.
Yeah, there is a bridge. I mean, but as I said, with MMT, it's very difficult to engage the MMT movement, frankly. I mean, they're very sure of their own ground. And Randall Ray refused a conversation with me and told me to take a hike. And he told me to get an education at Levy Institute. And then he talked to me. Well, I mean, come on. So, yeah, I mean, they have, as I said earlier, some sticking points on money being debt, which I just don't see the point, because if we're going to stay with a debt-laden economy, what have we resolved? But that's an accounting thought, that money, when it's issued, it must have a double entry accounting entry that it's somebody's debt, and it's not necessarily so, and it's actually not so at all.
Let's go
I
to Stephen.
understand. Thank you. And thank you, Stephen, for being so patient.
That's okay, yeah.
Thanks, Bernice.
I was just wondering, how do you think people will behave with the UBI, and what kind of planning decisions do you think need to be made, which would be different?
Well, you know, the evidence, such as it is out of pilots like Finland, is that that doesn't make a great deal of difference, really. You know, I mean, people's participation in the labour market didn't seem to change very much. I mean, people simply have their well-being is certainly increased because they are aware of the security of it. Although, again, as I say, in a pilot over the last 2 years, how much guarantee or secure do you feel about a 2-year pilot? But I mean, the argument would certainly be well-being increases, health increases, and lifestyle choices. I do think and hope that we will move away from the 8 to 4 factory or the 9 to 5 office straitjacket. I think it's become an unnecessary imposition. Now, it'd be a bit cynical to say it's to keep people off the streets, but it almost is, and therefore allow people to flourish and to find different ways to live their lives. Now, I accept that that may require some re-philosophizing for people of, you know, how am I able to live my life more independently, more creatively, to make choices that I couldn't make before? But I mean, so that may require debate, discussion, a kind of soft educational process by which people can discuss these things. But I mean, my friends, people that I know who've retired, none of them want to go back to work. They're all helping kids learn to sail at the sailing club. They're taking photographs and all, you know, that sort of stuff. So, I mean, most people seem to be able to find creative activity that they find, you know, fruitful and rewarding. And this whole idea that dignity comes from work, I think, is a mistake, because I think, as Michael was saying earlier, 50% of people don't work anyway. Do they have no dignity? Of course they don't have no dignity. They have dignity because dignity is inherent to the human being, in my view. It's not dependent on externalities. I mean, it's the dignity within the human that confers dignity on the work, rather than the other way around. So, yeah, I mean, I think there could be, and hopefully should be, because since the days when work was, you know, the curse of Cain, and it was absolutely hard labor and you died of it, and you're working 70-hour weeks, 100-hour weeks, and all the rest of it. You know, we have put work back in its place, that we have more say, you know, more sovereignty over our own lives. So I think that might be problematic at first as a transition, but I think ultimately be a very welcome freedom.
Michael.
Yeah, just a quick one.
Oh, sorry.
One of the reasons is, I think the political class or the public service, they don't know how to plan for such a society. So they don't want it, even if it makes a lot of sense. Do you know what I mean? Right now.
Well, but, you know, nevertheless, we've come to a 35-hour week society. We were a 70-hour week society. So, I mean, we have managed to evolve with more leisure, without massive disruption or revolution. So I think, you know, step by step for the working week to go down. People are now talking about 4-day weeks, and several people I know actually implemented a 4-day week. You know, they are working 4 days. So, yeah, I mean, how much that's planned for, because it's determined by the planners, or how much it's their response to how people choose to live. I see it as, you know, a sort of very benign change in the ability that I can go and paint in my garden. I can't paint to save my life, you know, but if I could, I got a drawing age of about 4, but you know, if that were my thing and I could do that, I think, you know, you gently move forward into that paradigm. It's not sort of some massive immediate jerk, is it? Or is it? Do you think? I don't know.
Well, I think people will flee cities, basically. There'll be a large movement. That might be one thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, why don't people like city life if you think cities
they're
are
there because they need the job or they're just stuck.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's go to Michael.
You just took the words out of my mouth again, Jeff. I was going to talk, going back to your Keynes point, and talking about the fact that we don't seem to have achieved his ideal of, you know, a 15-hour week, but because we've got this dichotomy where people are working 40, 60 hours and being paid, and then we've got unemployed and underemployed and people who are literally unable to work, those people in poverty. If you add up that's about 25% of the population, which if we've got the resources to provide a good life for them. So if we rejig our weekly hours and add in a basic income as well, between those two things, we can achieve already, I believe, what Keynes said we ought to be enjoying. So that was one point. And the other point was how to get there. Again, taking your point about pilots and what you made in your book of doing it gradually, we're looking to say, well, we don't have to make this, you know, a big bang approach. We can start at $10 a week. And I've been talking to our some of our leading charities, and $10 in Australia is basically food for a day for somebody. So even at that level, for somebody who's really poor, it's the difference between eating and petrol to get to work, you know. And so looking then at increasing it over time to get to the poverty line is one way I believe that you are right, and we've hit on that as well, to say, you know, do it gradually.
I agree.
Between Austin and I, the gradual is his gradual is much faster than my gradual. It's still, but it's still that approach, Jeff.
I agree. But, you know, I've always felt people a bit unfair to Keynes about that talk he gave, because it was a sort of talk to some school children on a Saturday afternoon or something. So, you know, it wasn't intended to be a peer review, which he's been taken to task for ever since. But I mean, he was pointing philosophically in the right direction, and quantitatively he might not have been exactly correct. And he underestimated, of course, the ability for us to consume ever more. But fundamentally he's right. And as you say, we should enjoy the fruits of that rather than seeing it as a threat to our living.
I am speaking of Keynes and his apparently wrong prediction. One thing that you were saying, you know, that was brought up before is like, how would society change? So David Graeber addresses a lot of this stuff in his book Bullshit Jobs, and he says that actually Keynes's prediction sort of came right in the sense that primary production and primary and secondary industries, you know, mining and manufacturing, they do take up less and less of the labor force, and it's the expansion of the services industry, you know, lawyers, waiters, people sort of doing stuff that, you know, doesn't actually create anything. It's just sort of mostly working in affect and working in other areas. And obviously some of that's medical services and really valuable stuff, really valuable services that are being provided that are really enriching people's lives. But that the core problem of providing want in terms of eliminating want in terms of material want, that we basically, if that was our goal, then the working week would have shrunk. I mean, one of the things that I've heard David Graeber say, and what Chomsky says something similar as well about student debt. He says, well, what happened was that they saw people in the 60s and 70s, that the ruling class saw what could happen if people had it too easy, and that there could be a broader countercultural movement, and society would be more likely to, that they wouldn't be able to stop a total social breakdown of the social order. And that's why things like student debt and you know, wage suppression and all that became more of a political imperative. You know, David Graeber says it's a moralistic urge to create these bullshit jobs. I mean, is is that what's blocking basic income? Do you think there's any worth in that narrative?
No, I think the idea that work is worthy and that everybody should work to eat is a fundamental philosophy that is difficult to break. And so, as I say, all welfare systems in the UK, I mean, this universal credit is posited upon the fact that you're not able to get a job and that you should demonstrate that you have been looking for a job and all this sort of stuff. And talking to my colleagues in China, the work ethic there is extremely strong. You work a 9 or 10 hour day and feel proud of it and all the rest of it. So it is difficult to change these paradigms. But the classic case, as you say, mining and stuff like that, is agriculture. I mean, you see the massive reduction in work, the workforce required to bring in the crops and to bring in the agricultural produce. So it's undeniable. I mean, they're absolutely huge shifts over time, and it will continue.
And of course, when those changes happened, there was massive social displacement as productivity, as technology displaced people. The Luddites, it's not a label that people like. They don't like to be called a Luddite, but they did have a point at the time, in that people were being, forced into destitution as wage labor disappeared. And so people say often, oh, well, new jobs come along and replace the old one. It's like, well, yes, and that process of transition is awful for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I mean, we get that point made in discussions over here. Only a couple of weeks ago, we had a conference on basic income at the Festival of Ideas here in Bristol, and one contributor who actually lives locally in Bristol, she was saying, well, we've been here before, the argument that high technology is going to reduce demand for labor and therefore blah, blah, blah. But actually, we have been there before, but look at the results. The results of where we've been before are these dysfunctionalities in the economy, the massive inequality we've all been talking about, the in-work poverty, the low bullshit job, low pay rates, and all the rest of it. So, I mean, we are living at the moment with the results of that technology, and we need a new paradigm to correct for it and get income to people.
So I have an analogy that I like to use, a metaphor. If you're a fairly technologically, scientifically minded person, you're probably aware of what they call the beer can problem in rocketry.
No,
okay.
no.
Okay. So well, you look at a rocket, even the shiny new ones by Elon Musk. And everyone else, please put your hands up so you can so we can get some more questions that aren't my weirdo ones. But anyhow, in the meantime. So when they fill up a rocket, that they've got their initial payload, which is, the capsule at the top with the astronauts in it. Then they need enough fuel to lift that. Then they need the fuel to lift the fuel. Then they need the fuel to lift the fuel to lift the fuel, then the fuel to lift the fuel, and so on and so on. And each time it's sort of, there's a greater and greater inefficiency, and it gets to a point where it becomes, a nightmare. And so you can imagine the economy as having a similar problem. So we have a certain amount of labor we need to do to get the food and the let's not even just say the stuff we need, the stuff we want, the food and the shoes and the sushi and stuff that we want, right? And then we need a certain amount of management. We need a certain amount of extra labor to manage those systems that's doing that labor. So, you need an accountant for the shoe factory or whatever, right? And then we need, someone to build the house for the accountant to live in. So there's kind of a beer can problem in the economy as well. Right.
Okay.
But what we're doing in our society, rather than trying to reduce that inefficiency, we're trying to maximize that inefficiency because that creates jobs. And that's what we're doing by constantly pumping, trying to create new industries, a lot of which are then, B2B is huge, business to business. It's business services for businesses, for businesses, all the way down, turtles all the way down, and you never get to a consumer until you've gone 14 steps. Is that a product of, this, does that relate to your view of technology and the basic income at all, and debt? Does it plug in at all, make any sense to you?
Well, are you saying there's a multiplier effect, aren't you? That you spend
if you make a bit of bullshit work, then you have to do real work to support the bullshit work, right? For every bit of inefficiency you introduce into the system, you actually you have to do support work for that. So you create a jobs program, you bet your job guarantee program, and you say, okay, we're going to have people build a veg. I've heard ridiculous silly things like organic vegetable gardens that are going to you know, or whatever they're going to do in local. That's what they're doing. Now you need to have shovels and picks and energy and transport and uniforms and stuff. So when you create a little bit of and the same goes for advertising. You know, you open a new advertising firm, sort of the definition of a bullshit job. You know, you sort of trying to drum up demand. That the advertising firm actually needs a building, actually needs the stuff, and that's in a sense why we can keep coming up with enough work to make it look like everybody needs a job. We can keep it at this high that the level of employment is that if we tried to, as I've heard people suggest, like Stephen, you know, and other people in this group suggested, we tried to minimize employment and get people to getting as much of their income as possible from a basic income. If we tried to get as close as we can to your machine that just plugs into the earth and does everything, we could probably get closer than we think. Because once you start taking out, once you start taking out garbage, you can take out the struts that are there to support that garbage as well. So it's a complicated analogy, but I think we're getting somewhere. Yeah.
No, you are, but I mean, essentially, it comes back to this reliance on work as the, you know, the most important driver in the economy and the being of humans and all the rest of it. And as you say, therefore, people seem to be prepared to put up with bullshit jobs and in-work poverty and you know, extended retirement years and all this kind of stuff, because they think that putting everybody under the banner of work is the solution to social living, to the economy, and to personal living. And it's that philosophy that, you're right, I mean, fundamentally needs challenging.
Lou.
Yes, thank you. This is quite interesting discussion, and I see it as a number of different issues. The first is money needs to be dealt with separately. Work at the moment is a money distribution system. It seems we don't know how to distribute money unless it's attached to work, and it can be quite bloody useless work. On the other hand, if people put the same energy into industry as they put into football, you just wouldn't believe they'd be able to put men on Mars and bring them home again and do whatever they like. But I think there is one thing. We already have the basis of a UBI, and it works in Australia, and it's called the age pension. And it's the trouble is it's discriminatory. It's not available to everybody, if you know what I mean. And also the source of the money at the moment is supposed to come out of taxation. And I think they're questions we need to answer. I'm quite, I'm a bloody pensioner, but the whole trouble is it isn't enough. And I think we could start with the pension we've got and try and morph that into our UBI, because I can't see any other way that you're going to bring a UBI in with the mindset of the politicians we've got today.
Lou, I'll just jump in really quickly because I'd like to respond about the Australian context in particular, and Basic Income Australia's position is that we would leave all payments in place, including, say, for example, the aged pension, and bring in the basic income alongside it. And now it would end up we would suggest that it is counted as taxable income, at least by the welfare system. And that way you just sort of, by increasing the basic income, you gradually ramp out other payments. But it's always by increasing people's unconditional income. Jeff, did you have a further response to Lou, or shall we go to Bernice?
No, only that in China, and I was talking with Chinese earlier this week, there is actually a universal elderly pension scheme. And again, he was saying that it's because part of the Confucian mentality is this very high respect for the elderly. And it is apparently a universal right. But I agree with you. I mean, if we introduce a basic income, I'd look to displace household debt in the first place, not other welfare benefits.
Bernice.
Sorry, I'm just trying to keep up with the conversation that's saying you would displace household debt. The reason I put my hand up is because I'm still struggling to understand the switch away from. So you were saying that with modern monetary theory, they're still looking at it as debt, whereas you're saying don't look at the money as debt. I'm struggling to understand that bit, and I was wondering if you could be so kind as to explain it again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not pretending, I have a total understanding here. I mean, we're all sort of, edging our way forward in understanding, and me included. So, I mean, but technically, I'd see no problem. I see no reason why the central bank couldn't credit all of our bank accounts tomorrow with $1,000. They've got the technical feasibility to do that. So I don't. Whilst
But doesn't
the central
that
bank
become a debt to the government? Isn't
no,
that
why? At the moment, it does. In present structures, yes. But I'm arguing that that is not necessarily so. It is so, but it's not necessarily so. So
you'd have to
if
get
the
away
Bank of
from
England,
double entry bookkeeping to be able
yes,
to do that?
you have to get around from double entry bookkeeping. You do at government level, and that's where I'm arguing it's a category error at government level. So double entry bookkeeping is correct at individual and business corporate level. But at government macroeconomic level, I argue it's a category error. Now, the interesting thing is that
That's a radical idea.
Well, it's not. Yes, it is, and yes, it's not. Because MMT argue that balanced budgets are a category error at the macroeconomic level, i.e. you've got to balance your budget as an individual, you've got to balance your budget as a business or match it by debt. But MMT will say it's a category error to apply that to the national economy. And my challenge back to them, but it's equally a category error to say that the creation of money is equal to debt, because you look at cash. Cash is only 3% of the money base at the moment. That 3% is created without any debt being assumed by the government. And my argument is if you can do it for 3%, you can do it for 100%. So, as I say, if the Bank of England put, or in Australia, whatever your bank is, put $1,000 into everybody's account by electronic means, which they can almost do. Okay, a central bank digital currency would help with that, like they've got in China with the yuan and in Cambodia. But I mean, they could do it through our present commercial banking systems. I happen to bank with HSBC. They could, have my bank account details and stick £1,000 in there. Now, if they did that tomorrow, say they only did it to me, and they put £1,000 in my bank account tomorrow, they haven't borrowed it from anybody. They've just created it. Who have they borrowed it from?
So Bernice, could I just say the issue really is, as you say, it's an accounting requirement that, say, the Reserve Bank has to have an entry on both sides of its balance sheet. But on one side, it's just money on issue. It's not a debt, it's just money on issue.
It means that we would have...
Sorry. It's not owed to anybody.
It means that that the central bank would be needing to see money not as an asset, but we as individuals would be seeing it as asset. Oh God, this is messing with my head.
Well, they do talk about, of course, what is the promise issued on a note, and of course everybody was taught in school, I promise to pay the bearer on demand, all this stuff. But all you get for $100 bill if you go to the bank is another $100 bill. I mean, that's all there. So who has any obligation as a result of the existence of a $100 bill? I would actually argue nobody has an obligation, but somebody has a potentiality, i.e. the supplier of goods and services has an option here that isn't an obligation. They're not obliged to supply goods and services, but they have an opportunity so to do. And the social convention so far means that by and large, they've taken up that opportunity and say, okay, if you've got $100 in their pocket, I'll sell some ice creams, or I'll make some clothes, whatever else it is, give some sailing lessons, so on and so forth, in order to service that need. But the existence of the $100 bill isn't an obligation on anybody, and it's not a debt to anybody either.
Well,
of course,
isn't it, in a sense,
personal is a debt. Sorry?
Isn't it, in a sense, money is a promise by the government that someone in that economy will accept it and give you something for it? When the government, an Australian dollar is a promise for some output of the Australian economy. Now, is a promise a debt? And I mean, this is where it gets. I was a philosophy grad, and there's a point I realized in my in my second or third year, one of my philosophy professors just said, you know, this is another definitional argument. We're arguing about the definition of something, and that doesn't matter. We can call it debt, or we can call it not, you know, in a sense, where some people would say, you know, Alex Howlett is another thinker we had on this show, and he's very similar to you in many regards. But one thing he would quibble with you about is this,
yeah, I know.
This issue of debt. And like, so he would say, well, you know, government spending is just the issuing of money, and government debt doesn't, the government's sort of debt, outstanding debt doesn't matter. Deficit spending rather is the issuing of money. And outstanding government debt just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it goes up to 200, 300, 400% of GDP, because there's just no consequence to it. The only consequence is if there's overspending, which goes into the economy and you know, makes too many promises. And therefore he would say, you know, that there's the economy as a whole somehow owes you a debt if you have a currency token, right? And so that therefore it is a debt in a sense. But it seems to me that it's getting very much to like, well, what do you want to call that, a debt or not? It seems like it's just one of these definitional questions where we could say, well, all money just is debt, and in this case the debt is owed to you by the whole economy. Or we could say, no, this money is not debt based. Some money is. Money issued by banks is debt based, and it's different from this sovereign money issuing that you're talking about. And that is that just a definitional question? Or is it a structural difference in policy that you're prescribing?
No, money can represent. I see Michael's wanting to go. Money can represent debt. I mean, for example, if you lent me some money and I agreed that was a debt, then that money would represent a debt that we'd voluntarily entered into. And the same with a commercial bank. I mean, I happen to run a business in Bristol, and I borrow from Barclays Bank, and that I accept that is a debt and it's denominated in money. But I follow Michael Kumhoff. I don't think that money is quintessentially debt. It's only debt when I decide to denominate some debt in the currency, as I do when I buy some goods and services. So debt ends up being one of those goods and services. But to me, I mean, I know Alex's view because I work with him quite closely, Alex Howlett, and I disagree. I mean, he's taken the MMT definition that money represents debt, which is what Randall says, what Stephanie says, and so on. I do fundamentally disagree. I'm not on my own about it on this. You look at the work from Michael Kumhoff and other people, and actually it does matter, you see, because when you then get 110% of your GDP as your national debt, and then people are saying, hey, we can't go any further than this, mate. You know, we can't have any more social care, we can't have any more poverty relief because we're already debt with 110% of GDP. Now, for Alex and Stephanie and Randall to then say back to governments, don't worry about 110%, let it go to 500%. I think that's going to be a very difficult sell, frankly. And in any case, I actually don't buy the argument that it will be matched by other surpluses in the economy in the simple way they put it. I mean, it is an identity. I mean, it's absolutely clear. Wingardley was right, Francis Cripps was right. It is an identity, but it is a post hoc identity. It is not an equation. It's not a behavioral equation. So the argument that I can add 10 billion to government debt, and this will immediately become 5 billion surplus in either the personal or financial sector of the economy is simply not true. I mean, what will happen is if I put another 10 billion on government expenditure, all the economy will go through all its functions and all the rest of it, and we will come to another position where the identity still applies, but at a different level. And it's that mix, in my view, conceptual mistake of an identity as an equation, which, you know, I want to politely argue back with them, but I have worries about it. And I just don't think, why do we have to go there?
I bet you'd get a really polite response from the MMT crowd. I bet you'd get a
they're
really
incredible.
Yeah, you'd get a really
incredible.
like calm. I just experienced it at a very casual level a few years ago. I've been familiar with MMT and, you know, stuff via Steve Keen and stuff like that, and then I got into more and more into basic income, and I was like, well, these two things go together like, you know, bread and jam. This is perfect. Yeah, and then I went into
I gave a presentation. I was invited to a conference in Berlin. It was a MMT conference, a second European MMT conference in Berlin. I was invited by the organizers to go and speak on basic income, so I did. And when I got there, I got people in the audience saying, how dare you come to an MMT conference and introduce UBIs? I was invited. But yeah, it's incredible. Michael wants to say something.
Yeah, we'll get to Michael in just a sec. But you were definitely called a neoliberal, weren't you, at one stage during the conference?
Oh, I've been called everything in my life. When I worked in Russia for 16 years, because I argued against the World Bank and IMF's policies in 1990, disbanding Gosplan overnight, I was called a crypto-communist and banned from all World Bank projects. And then, as you say, I get called a neolib by Randall and Co. So, you know.
Michael.
I just wanted to raise this issue of debt. I agree with you once again, Jeff, that money fundamentally is not a debt of government, but I think part of the problem is most of our money, as you would know, currently is issued as bank loans, which are then debt of the borrower. And so that whole concept that money is currently debt needs to be addressed. And this comes back to the thing that I talked about right at the very beginning, that if we think of money as a sovereign right, that it's three ways we can then issue it. We can issue it as a government deficit, ultimately. We can issue it as bank loans, or we can issue it to citizens for spending. And that the bank loans are debt because the borrower is getting something, new money that they've not earned. They have to add value, go and work, they earn and they repay it. So after they've worked and repay it, they're square. They've put back in what they took out. So that's a perfectly reasonable way for us as a society to issue new money, so long as it's not going into the bloody financial economy. But if it's going into real stuff, then having banks issue loans to people means that we've got a broad organisation across the whole economy charged with checking that, you know, borrowers can repay and the security is good and the purpose of the loan and so on. So that's a really valuable function. Government spending deficits, I'm less supportive of just giving government a whole go at it, because tax does enable us as a citizenry to have some sort of a say in, don't be profligate. You've got to actually justify. That said, if governments were to borrow sovereign money for assets and the repayments of that be made over the life of the asset, then once again, we as taxpayers, both current and future, are paying for that. So if we saw the government having some access at least to sovereign money, but that because the UBI is to pay basic needs and survival, that ought to be the absolutely primary way in which we issue money. If there's any other resources left over in the economy, which there obviously is, then the government and the banking sector gets dibs on it through their processes. But the very first level ought to be all of our resources are paid or provided to meet basic needs, and that we do through the UBI. So that's the sort of argument that in the paper that we want to present to you, Jeff, but it's fundamentally in support of what you're saying, but maybe with a couple of wrinkles in it.
Yeah, no, we need to debate it. I mean, I agree with all of that. But I would add that the reversal of austerity cuts is important to me, and I think that you know, the poor, I don't want to sound patronising, you know, low-income groups have suffered really badly in the last several years in the UK because of austerity cuts, which are all driven by the perceived need to keep the deficit low and the debt increase down. I agree with you about bank lending, incidentally. I mean, my colleague Joseph Huber, who I had dinner with in Berlin before the pandemic struck, I mean, Joseph does want to see all money creation go to the central bank, and therefore he disenfranchise all the commercial banks. And as he knows, the central bank in Switzerland voted against the referendum because they said, we're not set up to do what you've just said, to deal with personal borrowers or commercial borrowers. We just haven't got the resources to do it. We haven't got the expertise to do it. We haven't got the systems to do it. Therefore, we don't want to do it. And Joseph's proposal to charge the central bank with doing that, I think, was pretty unrealistic. And I mean, if I'm a neo-lib by saying that commercial banks should be allowed to exist, then I'm a neo-lib, you know. But so I mean, you know, I borrow from a bank. I run this business in Bristol. We have a 25-year loan. It's paid back and blah blah blah. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it needs the constraints of saying, is this investment reasonable? Is it going to generate for society or whoever value rather than not? So, and the commercial banks are pretty well set up to do that.
There's one thing though, I think that it would be useful is if we were to say that the commercial banks are there to lend for use in the real economy. So if you've got a business or you're buying goods or services or whatever, but any lending into the financial economy needs to come through the secondary markets, not through the issue of new money. And so that would be a major problem, I think, for the banking industry to accept that. But yes, if we said to the banks, you can create money, but it needs to be for useful purposes, not to buy blinking securities in the financial markets.
Yeah, and I agree, but I also think Joseph is right about seigniorage. I think he's right about that the creation of seigniorage by the commercial banks is giving them huge, you know, free handouts. So I would, instead of, I'd introduce a seigniorage tax on them, actually, so that you do reduce seigniorage to the community.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go to Bernice.
Bernice is running the question, what's seigniorage?
You can have two questions because I want to know what seigniorage is as well. So, yeah.
Okay, good.
It's the difference between the cost of creating money and the value of that money. So in the old days, when you had to produce, you know, notes and coins, then that had a certain physical cost to actually produce them. But in most cases, the value of those is far greater than the cost of producing them. It's not always been the case. Apparently in 18th century UK, the bullion value of coins was higher than their value in circulation. And people were shipping them off to Paris and melting them down because they're getting more, you know, for the gold or the copper, whatever it was, than the value of the coin in circulation. But generally speaking, certainly with digital money, I mean, digital money is virtually not costless. The marginal cost is almost zero. So it's the difference between the value of the money once it's out there and what it costs you to produce it. That's the seigniorage. And at the moment, that seigniorage goes to the banks. And I agree with Joseph, there should be a seigniorage tax. I also think, very quickly on Michael's previous question, that when central banks buy government debt, they currently do it in the secondary market. They're not allowed to buy it when the governments first issue the debt, the gilts or the treasury bonds or whatever it is. And they can only go in, the central bank, and buy it from insurance companies, pension funds, stockbrokers, and all the rest of it, who buy it in the primary sale. And the problem with that is that the central bank's coming in and buying from these intermediaries who are making huge risk-free margins at the moment. So this 875 billion bought by the Bank of England from the insurance companies, the pension funds, the stockbrokers, rich individuals and so on, has had the effect of increasing the value of their portfolios and granting them huge risk-free profit margins. It's a scandal in my view. So either the central bank should be allowed to buy in the primary market or we should create debt-free sovereign money. It's a simple financial scandal, the amount of value that's being created to these intermediaries through the central bank being kept out of the primary market.
The government of Ecuador broke that rule during the presidency of Rafael Correa, and they did this even with a dollarized economy. So they didn't even have their own currency; they were already on the dollar when he took power. I mean, he's basically, you know, it's as if you became Prime Minister of Great Britain, or Steve Keen became Prime Minister of Australia or something. It's a remarkable situation where this backwoods heterodox economist became the president of the country. Just basically integrated the central bank into a grand ministry of planning, said, you're going to finance government spending, you're going to issue digital currency that's exchangeable for dollars inside Ecuador. Did it, got away with it. The IMF told him, well, your economy is going to crash. You'll never, your name will be mud in this town. And of course, you know, it was one of the sharpest reductions in poverty and most, you know, successful development programs anyone's ever seen anywhere, which is why you never hear about it. But, you know, the threat of a good example. But Ecuador is an example of where this heterodox economics has already worked. And even without its own currency, which a lot of people would say is the limiting factor, so they say Greece couldn't do it or whatever because they're on the euro. Well, I would suggest everyone have a look at Ecuador. We've only got, I should shut up because we've only got 6 minutes left. We're going to go to Lou and then Michael. I'll ask everyone to try and keep their questions fairly short so we can wrap up on time.
Only a comment, Austin. In the early days of settlement in Australia, they never had currency, so they used rum. Remember, like they used rum to exchange goods and services. The only trouble is some of the people were drinking the bloody stuff.
Well, I don't mind some debt-free rum, yeah.
Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on the signage side, Jeff. My understanding of the way the banks work is that when they issue a loan, they're basically making two entries. One is the entry on the debit side, which is the amount of money you have to repay, and on the credit side, the amount of the deposit that you can draw down. And it's that double entry that's creating the money, and that when the loan is repaid, those entries are reversed, so that the bank never actually sees the face value of the money. The bank never gets that. All the bank gets is the interest, and the interest is going to pay basically their cost of operations, their profit, and also a provision for loss on bad loans, and to some extent inflation. So the bank, in my view, is not earning unreasonable monies, except for the fact that they've cornered the market and can charge huge interest rates that deliver them huge bonuses and profits, but that the actual service is not doing anything that is antisocial, and that we should allow the banks to continue that process and widen it to new fintechs who will be able to deliver that service at a fraction of the cost, because they're not going to have all the big office buildings and the huge people overhead and everything. And that if we allow them to issue sovereign money in exactly the same way, then as the current banks do, then we actually could end up with very efficient services at relatively little cost. But anyway, that's another
point well taken, Michael. Thank you for that. Yeah. And actually, you mentioned kindly my book. If I could also, in closing, mention the website, ubi.org, www.ubi.org. I mean, I've tried to make that as non-partisan as possible, and it's not trying to sell my own point of view particularly, but it is there as a resource. So, I mean, if you and other activists and advocates find it a useful resource, it's there to be used, such as www.ubi.org.
Okay, well, I will actually show everyone what that looks like right now, because I was about to do some screen sharing anyhow, just to wrap up. This is ubi.org, and this has a bunch of great stuff here. There's and it has all these people, some of whom I don't like, so it's a terrible website. Actually, no, I'm just joking.
Yeah, I know. That's the problem. Yeah.
That's the problem. Is you've got some people on here I don't like, so therefore I've turned off the UBI completely. Now that I see Barack Obama and Mark Zuckerberg like it, I think it's a terrible idea. Thought it was a good idea until a second ago, but then
this same conference in Berlin, actually, somebody from the British Labour Party came in, put up a picture of Richard Branson and said, that's why I don't agree with UBI, because he does. So I said, well, interesting methodology, but I think Richard Branson also thinks that 2 + 2 = 4. Does it make that wrong as well?
Yeah, or that we should wash our hands after we go to the toilet. You know, I guess that makes it a terrible idea.
I do think it's a hella suspicious that all of these mega rich people support the UBI, though. It's like, what are they trying to get from it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, but you know, I'm not necessarily. Yeah, okay. I mean, I could be cynical about mega rich people, but and I am. But I think that some of the people working in high tech do realize that technology is sucking income out of the economy. So I agree with my friend Neil Lawson, who runs the Compass think tank, and Neil's very left of center. He says, look, we should give some people the benefit of the doubt. Just because they're rich doesn't mean they're totally evil, and maybe they're saying some things that we can identify with. But yeah, I mean, I agree. But I mean, Guy Standing made the same comments. That's why I put him on the top page, so that he'd feel he'd feel that I'd given the left true space. But I tried to get more women on, actually. And Diane Coyle, an economist in UK, told me that there are no female economists she can think of who support basic income. So I'll try and find some, but so far she looks sadly right. But who do you think we should take off there then? I took Elon Musk off there for obvious reasons. Who else should I take off?
Well, no, I'm just joking. I think it's fine. I have a theory that billionaires are...
Is it just Branson and Zuckerberg?
I think they're all fine. I think it's very interesting when Mark Zuckerberg presented a basic income at the Stanford commencement talk, or wherever he talked about it. He said that something, I think I'll get the line wrong, but it was something like, he said, I got to take a lot of shots and make a lot of mistakes. And if everybody gets to take a lot of shots, then we'll all be better off as a society. And I think it's quite possible that that's really what he believes. And then he said, I would never have built Facebook if I'd had to worry about, he got fired, he got kicked out of university and wasn't but he didn't care because he knew he had a social safety net and he could mess about and do whatever, right? And out of that can come incredibly productive stuff. And I have a theory that billionaires are morally average, that they're not actually very different from normal people, that it's just a kind of, that they're not necessarily better or worse people than anybody else. Maybe there's a filter, maybe there's a filter for psychopaths in business that favors them or something, but I don't know. Michael's got his hands up. We're going long. So last question, Michael.
I'll put my hand down. That's fine.
Okay. The other things I was going to show people on this screen are the basic income meetup page. If you're in Australia and you're interested in these ideas and you want to hear more about them, come to the basic income meetup page, the Basic Income Facebook page, or the Basic Income Australia Facebook page, or basicincomeaustralia.com. So that is meetup.com/basicincomeau, facebook.com/basicincomeau, or basicincomeaustralia.com if you're in Australia and you want to connect with the growing basic income community here. I believe the next thing we're doing is a trivia night. Emma, is that right?
Yeah, I got some great material for questions right out of this. Yeah.
Fantastic. And that's next Friday, right?
No, Saturday. Yeah.
Okay, next Saturday. That's right. We were going to have this on a Saturday too to make it consistent, but it didn't quite work with Jeff's schedule. Jeff, thank you for making time for us. It's been a real pleasure. I know you mentioned to me that you don't really like the Q&A style before this, but so thank you for coming and enduring an attack from all angles. We've had you outnumbered, but you've fared very well. And I'll just wrap up this live stream now, and we are done.
Well done with all you're doing. Thank you all.